Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining us today at the 2018 edition of EXPO Chicago, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and professionals on current issues that engage them. Today, our 4 p.m. discourse is Curatorial Forum on Immersion and Senses. The format of contemporary exposition often relies on sight and the visual impact of artists' works within the static space of galleries, museums, or institutions. This panel will trace how non-concrete senses, scents, tastes, and aural forms are exhibited in space.
Thank you. Well, 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 2 naughty, nasty little children gone. 3 good, sweet little children left. Hurry, please. Long way to go yet. Oh, wait a minute. Must show you this. Lickable wallpaper for nursery walls. Lick an orange. It tastes like an orange. Lick a pineapple. It tastes like a pineapple. Go ahead. Try it. Oh.
I got a plum. Grandpa, this banana's fantastic. It tastes so real.
Try some more. The strawberries taste like strawberries. The snozberries taste like snozberries.
Snozberries? Who ever heard of a snozberry?
We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams. Come along, come on.
Hi. Hello? Hi. Thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, about the vials, yeah, they're not flavor artworks, they're scent artworks, so don't try to drink them or anything. Yeah, so it is 2 different previous compositions that I made. One of them is related to a show at Bridget Donahue that I did this past year, and that is that show, the concept was different mixtures of molecules that target particular olfactory receptors in the human nose. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's the one that's called OR10R2. And of course, at any point, you're welcome to open the cap and smell these different scents. The other one is called Hexa, and that's just basically a fragrance composition I made where all of the molecules contain a cyclohexane ring. So that's a 6-carbon ring structure. So they're pretty much just kind of linked by that shared substructure of their molecular shape. But I'll get to a little bit more of that in a second. So this image, if you look on the left, there's that kind of shape, and that's a molecule that I designed for a show at Artists Institute pretty recently. That molecule, you can see a little bit of some different people's descriptions of it on the right. I don't know if you're able to read it. It's maybe a little bit small, but it says there were 2 reviewers that we had review it in this case, and the first person said cleaning product, grapey apple, light pink association, bright sugary with a hint of vinegar. The second person said storage shed, pine floor cleaner, sweet peach, and alternative, I think it's
Aftershave.
Oh, aftershave, thank you. So yeah, you can see how it's 2 people smelling a molecule, and so this molecule hasn't existed before prior to when it was synthesized with a team that I worked with at Hunter College. So it's a new molecule. No one smelled it before up until that point, and then you see 2 very different, divergent kind of associations. And I think that's something that I've encountered, just all the time with working with fragrance and with flavor, is that people have very different perceptual systems, very different spaces of perception that they personally perceive flavor and fragrance with. And you know, and there's lots of reasons for that. Part of it is what you come to associate certain smells with just through exposure, and you know, a lot of that is culturally specific and just individually specific. And then there's also a genetic component where people have a pretty significant difference in the way that their scent receptors are expressed through their genes. And so there's about 400 different scent receptors in the human nose that function. There's a lot that don't function, that are kind of left over from, you know, evolution, but they still are present. But then, from what I've read, almost everyone is what they call anosmic to at least one scent. So everyone's missing at least one type of scent receptor, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and so this is just an install shot of that exhibition where I basically made 3 different kind of new molecules, but that was the, you know, that's one of the 3. And okay, and then this is the show at Bridget Donahue, and so the vial with the 10R2 is from that show. So with that show, there's 10 different scent mixtures, and these are all mixtures of pre-existing molecules. However, all of these molecules were developed by the flavor and fragrance industry, so none of these molecules occur in nature, but many of them are, you could say, designed to mimic nature. So often when a large fragrance company develops a new molecule, they have it in mind that they want to perhaps have a molecule that smells more like a rose than a rose itself does. And it's a bit like drug discovery in the way the pharmaceutical industry works, where, you know, they're targeting specific receptors, and sometimes a molecule can be developed just through changing its chemical structure to where it fits into a receptor better than the natural version, and so it'll elicit a stronger response to the person smelling it. So it's very similar to actually the way drugs are developed. They're just used for a different purpose. In this case, yeah. So in this case, all these 10 mixtures are, you know, from different flavor and fragrance industry molecules, and this is one example. This is the 10R2 example that you have, and you can see on the upper part it says components, and so those are the 3 molecules that are included in the mixture, and then below that is a superimposition. So that just shows how it kind of shows, you know, if you align all those molecules, put them together, that's what it looks like. And then below that is the substructure. So if you look at what all those 3 molecules have in common, then that's the substructure there. And then to the right of that is the olfactory activity, and you can see the 10R2 is highlighted. The reason that there's other receptors listed there is that those are kind of like general receptors, and the 10R2 is kind of a more specific type of receptor that's a little bit rare to be activated. And then this is kind of just like what a representation of what a receptor looks like. It's a very interesting area of biology. You know, humans have thousands of different types, and it's basically most of the largest family of genes is the genes that code for olfactory receptors, and then there's lots of other types of receptors in the body as well. But anyway, it's a kind of a string of protein that's coiled up and fits in the cell membrane, and then a molecule then fits in that coil of protein and activates it. It kind of switches it on, and then that causes a cellular response and ultimately a nerve response in the case of olfactory receptors. And this is an exhibition this is a while back. This was at Jessica Silverman Gallery, and basically you can't see it, but the walls are coated with a kind of a scratch and sniff paint coating. So actually a little bit like the lickable wallpaper, although not really as much for taste.
I'm glad I wasn't totally off base on that one.
Yeah. Okay. And basically, yeah, you scratch it and then you smell the smell, and what the smell is in this situation is a analysis of the gallery airspace that I did prior to the exhibition. So I kind of used this machine called it's kind of like, basically it's like a canister that you open the valve and then it sucks in the air, and you close it, you send that to a lab, and then they tell you, here's all the molecules that were in the air and here's their proportions, and then from that you can reconstruct the smell of the air more or less. And so that's what the smell was, that if you scratch the wall, then you'll get that scent. And then just real quick, some other work that I do is more flavor related, and often I try to have this work kind of circulate in the kind of more general economy, you know, not just in the art economy, not in the art space. This is a flavor that I designed for Soylent called Nectar, and it's the flavor is a synthetic version of a honeybee pheromone that honeybees use to mark food sources. And so that's the kind of concept. And it tastes a bit like lemongrass. Some people said it tastes like Fruit Loop cereal. And yeah, so that's that one. And then another thing I've been working on a lot is this algae-based food company called Non-Food. This is just like a promotional still of the Non-Bar, which is an algae-based protein bar. Here's just another kind of publicity kind of image. But the reason for algae is that it's just very sustainable. It grows, maybe 100 times faster than other kinds of crops, so it can supply theoretically, 100 times as much food with the same amount of resources. So, looking towards the future as a way to reduce, the kind of ecological footprint of the food system, I think algae is a very good kind of alternative food source, and so that's kind of the reason for focusing on it.
How does that one taste?
So we've been changing the taste, like ever since we launched it a year ago. We've been changing the taste, and it's definitely a very complex taste. So we wanted to have something that wasn't kind of mimetic, like most artificial flavors. It might taste like whatever, but they'll call it blueberry or they'll call it strawberry. They never have something that's kind of like abstract or just open, I think maybe one of the historical examples of a more abstract flavor in mass circulation is actually Coca-Cola. It doesn't taste like anything other than Coca-Cola. In particular. But anyway, I would say that that's kind of what we tried to achieve a little bit with the non-bar, is something that's not specific to any other thing. That being said, it's a bit fruity, a little bit nutty, and that's how I would describe it.
And generally delicious.
Yes, very delicious also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Some people have said it tastes like a fig Newton. That's probably the closest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anna?
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Gritz, as it was mentioned, and thank you. I was invited to program this year's EXPO video program, and so I'm going to speak a little bit about that because it relates to the senses, but maybe in a slightly different way, as I'm not propagating one sense over the others. The program is called Portrait of a Tongue Towards Non-Visibility, and you can actually just see it just on the other side of the festival hall, so if you haven't seen it yet, go check it out later on. And just before I discuss it, I just briefly want to thank Stephanie, Tony, Bianca, and Alexis for making all of this possible. And of course, all of the artists in the program. So while I speak about the program, I have a little video clip, which is an excerpt of Judy Chicago's film Women and Smoke from 1971. The film is silent, so I'm just going to speak over it once it plays. Can I just start it? Okay. Here we go. So there were two films that really early on inspired the program, and one of them is Hannah Black's film My Bodies that she made in 2014, and the other one is Tony Koch's recent presentation of his Evil series, but also other videos at the Berlin Biennial this summer. Both of them spoke to a concern of mine to think of the body as a site of overt physicality, but also as a site with the potential of its own obfuscation to escape the limiting options of representation that society leaves us with, and to also just get a better understanding of the way that we are conditioned to perceive ourselves and others through our bodies. Black wrote about her film in an interview that she actually tried to write an essay, and instead of writing that essay, she ended up making that video, which is something that is quite interesting because it's the same case with another one of the videos that is in the program by Ed Atkins, and I like this idea of kind of trying to do something non-visible, something immaterial, and ending up producing kind of a visual art piece. And she wrote, and I tried to write this thing about the abolition of the body, about this idea that if we were to abolish gender, if that could be even a serious political horizon, it would involve a complete reimagining of the conceptual train of the body, an unthinking or decreating of this idea of having a body. Tony Koch takes a slightly different approach, but he actually is the one that introduced me to the term non-visibility. And he introduces his films as reading devices. So all of his films, some of them have visuals as well, but a lot of them are purely text-based. And so he kind of shows these texts, but he accompanies them often by pop music, introducing the medium of video as a reading and a text, and this idea that some things are maybe better imaged in our imagination than actually giving us an image, because a lot of the images that he's working with are highly politically and kind of used up, or we don't have the same kind of access to them anymore than we might have them through text or through sound. So by extracting these sources from its original context and layering them with music, he tries to reveal the powers and the systems of power that kind of stand behind them, and recontextualizes them and subverts them, with the hope of recharging them and kind of giving them a new impact. So these two positions really urged me to take a closer look at the politics that make incongruous bodies, behaviors, and signs variously visible and invisible in public space, and how the senses such as touch, smell, and sound are socially constructed and are also policed around us, and how the general policing of undesirable bodies and practices is omnipresent and shapes our performances and our behavior in everyday space in turn. Both of these artists, and actually the others in the program as well, appear to argue for a misuse of the senses, almost a form of kind of imposed synesthesia to refreshen their loaded and preconditioned ways of apprehension. So the question that runs through the program is really not just how to portray the senses beyond sight, but how to escape a socially conditioned perception of our senses, meaning how to escape our sensed perception of ourselves and others. This sounds slightly convoluted, but just basically how can we think of our bodies outside of our bodies, which maybe feels impossible, and that's why some of these films might feel quite esoteric, but as an approach, I think it's a really helpful way to try to escape some of the conditioning and the programming that we've received purely by existing in this world. So maybe just a couple of notes on two of the films. So the film that we see, as I said, is Judy Chicago, and she had a really nice quote about this film stating, "There was a moment when the smoke began to clear, but a haze lingered, and the whole world was feminized, if only for a moment." So she started experimenting with smoke machines in the early 70s and then working with fireworks. So this is a mixture of both of them, mainly showing women using them in the desert, but she also worked with them on kind of streets in Pasadena. I try to think of this kind of softening, not just as a kind of cliche way of thinking about the feminine, but as a way to kind of softening outlines, making our statements maybe a little bit less determined. And for her, it was definitely kind of a counterpose to the kind of very macho way that maybe her contemporaries like Richard Serras were working with the environment, working with materials, leaving room for maybe second guessing and reinterpretation. And it might be worth mentioning that the way that she worked with landscape never involved any destruction, but kind of just a reframing. There's another piece that I just briefly want to mention by Candice Williams that is in the second viewing room dedicated to her installation, I always pronounce it German, Euripides, kind of based on the antique myth, and it's an installation that she made this year. And I don't know if you're familiar with the myth, but it's basically about the nymph that was permanently consigned to the realms of the underworld when her partner Orpheus was unable to trust her existence when he was trying to kind of take her out of Hades without a visual confirmation, and he decided to turn back, and by the kind of pure act of looking at her kind of lost her forever to the realms of the dead. And Williams has a really wonderful way of using this understanding of immateriality as the flip side of an overt concept of visuality and physicality that she traces in the entrapment of especially Black bodies and their existence in a feedback loop of fetishization and erasure. So I think my contribution to this panel is maybe instead of just thinking about the non-visual, thinking about how to reprogram the senses. Thank you.
Joey, we'll maybe skip to Joey's slide if you could. Thanks.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you for coming. I'm gonna have my back turned to you most of the time, which might be kind of appropriate in a way with my back turned to you, thinking about how does an art object speaks, which I often think of as a kind of backward glance of the self. That wasn't part of it. I'm going to talk about two strands of my work, my curatorial practice and my art practice. So I'm going to start with an exhibition I curated in Prague at the Futura Center for Contemporary Art, which was titled More Than Lovers, More Than Friends. I'm just going to continue.
Just continue.
Yeah. And it's an exhibition based on the idea of convolution, which is really a simple idea in mathematical terms, or thinking about algorithm growth, or in musical composition where two sounds make a third in an amplified form. And this room, I'm just going to talk about the smallest room in the space, which was almost at the center, kind of like the heart of the exhibition, of the architecture. The art center is built on the side of a hill. And this is a weirdly triangular non-shape of a room, which has three entrances and exits, and one at the back leads nowhere. So there are 4 works in this room, and maybe I can, also talk about that this is the room with the most works in the exhibition space. I often think about density as an important part of the exhibition context. And adjacent to this room, there's the largest room of the exhibition space was left empty. So thinking about like the memory of a space can be amplified and be contradicted when you walk through from one space to another. So there are 4 works in this space. You have this garment on the left, this sort of splay escapist garment made out of a soft parachute by the New York artist Elaine Weir. You have this maquette of a prison, which was made out of memory by an artist called Li Yuyang, who was imprisoned for 13 years, was released early, and he made a maquette of the zone in prison where the 3 exits lead to 3 different sort of activities that you are allowed to have in the prison, which was eating, sleeping, and being having outdoor activities. So it's sort of like a mise en abîme of the exhibition as well, having these 3 entrances. And in the back, you have a painting by Ben Schumacher, which depicts the metro stop at the Jefferson stop in Brooklyn, thinking about the kind of artistic socialized space, the limits of artistic production. I'll go to the next slide. And then immediately to the left, when you walk into the space, there's a vinyl piece, which it's by an artist, Nicholas Onsung, who had instructed the gallery to spray the vinyl with the scent, this perfume of a former lover every day. And what you're seeing are these characters from the artist's day job, which was to design for Airbnb a kind of scenario of hospitality, how to kind of be a guest and how to be a host and things like that. And so it was important for this exhibition to kind of bring in the day jobs or of some of the artists and working with artists who are not artists. So you see how this on the right, the stairs that lead to a kind of sudden drop. And I want to also now play a sound. This is the sound that you hear in this room, which is not a pure sound in a way, because you hear actually 3 different sounds happening at the same time from 3 different works. It's about a minute. So, 1 minute. 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 1 min Okay, so what you're hearing, it's sound installation or sound from an installation by a German artist, Tom Kubli, which uses exactly the idea of convolution to create a third sound, so to speak. And you hear this throughout the exhibition space as a kind of, I think of it as sort of blood pumping through the arteries of the exhibition space. And then you also hear a track from the end of the film by Louise Buñuel, Simon of the Desert, chosen by one of the participants of the exhibition. It's from another work which compiles all these different film endings that sort of dramatize the exhibition context. And then you hear also a sound from an animation in the next room. So it was really important for me to always think about how the different works can also create a sort of third or like extra experience of those artworks. Let's see what I have here. Let's see. Oh, sorry. So this is right outside of that triangular space where the film endings were being played, and you kind of walk into the exhibition space with the back of the screen to you. So again, thinking about what hearing before seeing as a kind of important sort of body knowledge that you get, and then when you walk through the exhibition space, you sort of take that with you. And to kind of like dislodge some of the ideas in the artworks. And this shows the passage of the exhibition space where the sound installation was. It's sort of like a weird exhibition space. There are three entrances, but only one exit. So it takes a few passages before you kind of discern the logic of the space. And I wanted also, to have this the stairwells that connect the top and the bottom floor to be a kind of a sort of important passage. And then elsewhere, there's a slide projection, now thinking about scent, specifically collaboration between the writer Vivian Sky Rayberg and artist Jason Henrik Hansma. There are 80 slides of images of the negative images of chiffon and interspersed with writing by Vivian Sky Rayberg. And I'll read a few of those for you. I'm not going to show you the slides with the text. In its earliest use, perfume designated the smell of something burning, a signal, portent, a warning. Sillage is the French term for a fragrance's wick, invisible but highly perceptible froth that is perpetually of the past. The peculiar quality of perfume time, scent as a structure in the everyday. Stuck in the metro, bombarded with raspy head notes, oud should be outlawed. And then just have a few slides here of a project I did thinking about the art fair context here, which is kind of interesting. This was from...
This was one of the only works that I knew of yours beforehand, when we were first originally working on the panel.
Yeah, this was from Artissima, which is an art fair in Turin. On the ground, it's are these, I don't know if you can see these leaves that I had collected from the door of my apartment in Paris when I was living there. So in a way, it's sort of, to me, it's really also a sound piece because it's only activated, is activated by walking on it, and then the smell then releases itself. And I've shown these a few times through the years, usually at the fall, but never at the same place, but always in different context. And I'm not sure, what the kind of scientific explanation for it, but they get stronger every year. The smell, I replenish them whenever I show them, and I don't know if it's the sort of sensorial memory that we kind of embed into the piece or not. This was in a project space by the artist Neil Bolufa, which was also a set for a film that he was making called Occidental in Paris. And then this was in a chateau at the Musée Rochechouart that has in this beautiful room with the 16th century fresco that depicts the exterior of the chateau, and then juxtaposed with a projection by the Thai filmmaker Apichapong Versantagol. So again, thinking about how these sort of the memory of the piece can circulate and sort of also take on the conditions of the exhibition context around it. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll want to talk more about memory, between all of us shortly, but Andria.
Am I on? Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about this subject. One of the things I'm hoping we can all talk about together is the question of how your body feels in space when you see an exhibition. I think the idea of an exhibition as a space as immersive is sort of the nature of being in that room. I'm going to talk about an exhibition that dealt specifically with the question of immersion in a collaboration between a young American artist, Tauba Auerbach, and a very senior French artist, or rather composer, Eliane Radig. We worked together for almost 2 years to create a collaboration and a collaborative space across disciplines and countries and experiences. And the entire nature of this collaboration was very much about creating a full sensory experience that would be very provocative and potentially induce a particular state of mind. So the exhibition was called Induction. Many of you are probably familiar with Tauba Auerbach's work. She's a painter and a bookmaker. And in this exhibition, it was her first time working in video. People are far less familiar with Eliane Radig. She is, I think, 87 at the moment, but was one of the first female composers to begin working with electronic synthesizers. And her work has been very motivated by her own research into Buddhism and meditation, and maybe we can just turn it down a little bit and I can have this sound in the background. But she really works throughout her compositions to create a physical experience for an audio piece. This is her longest composition that she's been working on with a variety of musicians. In her later years, she's been working acoustically, so not working with her synthesizer. But what we decided to show for the collaboration with Tauba was a piece from 1970, which actually references her later work, which we're listening to now, which is composed for live instruments. I think we can probably keep going. Maybe we'll listen just for a few minutes. All of her music is very minimal and requires you to spend time, and it's so soft and subtle that you actually have to really tune into your body to feel the sound. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep going because there's some sound later as well. This is an image of Eliane more recently working with another musician. She creates each of her compositions in collaboration with the musician over time. So the piece is developed through a series of rehearsals, and it's very much a dialogue, so the same piece is never played exactly twice. This is an installation image of the exhibition, and you can see there's a series of freestanding paintings by Taube and a glass sculpture in the center of the room. Eliane's work is actually installed inside the walls that you can see with the blue bench. The piece from 1970 is actually a construction of 3 different sound files that are playing at the same time. And I think if you heard the whole piece, it would be on for 36 years. It's an ongoing loop that changes very, very slightly. And the frequencies by which the different speakers are installed in the wall allow the wall to actually vibrate very gently. So the room itself became a kind of womb-like structure, and visitors were invited to actually lean against the wall, sit on the bench, lay down, have a very different kind of exhibition experience. And Taube worked closely with Eliane to create a kind of almost a set, a space in the exhibition using her own work that delineated space in a kind of series of meridians so that you would have a kind of physical geometry that aligned with your own understanding of, I guess, your meridians in your body. And through that process of working with Eliane, and they both practice Buddhism, but from different perspectives, they actually worked together to think about the ways that painting also embodies a kind of vibrational space. I'm gonna play this video, which is not the same as seeing the exhibition because it's impossible to show you how this space feels. I can tell you that I gave, I don't know how many tours, but the minute people came into the exhibition, their bodies changed, their facial expressions changed, they slowed down, they spoke softer. It actually did induce a kind of change by way of a sensorial experience. This is about as close as I can get, and it's a very amateur video, so bear with me, but you can kind of hear the sound. This is walking into a column that was very dark. It's the first video that you'll see, also Taube's first video. And when you enter the exhibition space around this corner, your eyes are intentionally adjusted to a completely dark space. The soft sound that you're hearing that sounds like air or rumbling or maybe thunder far away is Eliane's piece. It's at a very, very low frequency, but the longer you spend in the space, the louder the sound becomes. Channel video that defines the space of the room in addition to the paintings is also a piece that deals with vibration. It's actually a science experiment where oil is set inside the cone of a speaker, and as the speaker's on, if you drop oil on top of that body of oil, it will dance. And so Tava recreated this. It's a hydrodynamic, it's a crazy physics experiment, but she remade it in her studio, and the footage that you're seeing is close-up edited lit version of that experiment. But something very interesting happened in this space, that your sound, your audio sense tricked your eye sense into thinking that the audio piece and the video piece were actually in sync and created one for the other, but it's completely coincidental.
So it's like a manufactured synesthesia.
Exactly, but also as it was a first time experimental collaboration, it wasn't something that was the end goal, and so these interesting moments came out of the dialogue.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that manufacturing too. I think we have some time to discuss among all of you. I mean, thank you all so much for presenting on each of your bodies of work. But one of the things that I want to start with is, Anna, you made a comment during your presentation where you said some images are better in the imagination. And I believe, Sean, you also spoke about a missing receptor being able to sort of flip senses and have a different output for each person. And I feel like the reason why I assembled all of you too is because this the viewer's reaction to all of your work, whether it's curatorial or artistic, there's a lot of room for misunderstanding or purposeful misunderstanding. Harold Bloom, the theoretician, named this phenomenon poetic misprision, which is the purposeful misunderstanding of a source to get to another, to get to something new, a new departure point. So I'm wondering if maybe each of you can comment a little bit between like the fact and fiction, and maybe the best misunderstanding that you've had either in your work or in an exhibition when you've been in a space. Sean, I see you're nodding. That means that you have something.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, kind of, or I hinted at, the people's individual perception of the same scent can vary very widely, I think one thing that happens a lot, especially if there's, I mean, not all of my work is scent-based, but especially in cases where it is scent-based and it's being diffused into the room, is there's a tendency of the visitor to ask, like, what is the scent, or what is this scent, right? Like, what am I smelling? And then I know that often, or it might be like, is this particular scent? And since most of my scents are not necessarily referential to another thing, there's not like really any answer for that. But often, they'll ask if I'm there, they'll ask me, or otherwise someone at the gallery, they'll ask, like, what is, I think it smells like citrus. Is that right? And there's this tendency to ask, like, is this correct? Which I think is pretty interesting, because it's not usually the case with visual, the experience of visual art, that you doubt whether there's a correct answer,
or like,
or at least,
is this blue?
What's that?
Like, is this blue? Am I
Yeah.
blue?
Is this blue? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think so that's like often maybe the first response, or that's a common response. But then beyond that, then it's often very much open to interpretation, and there is no real interpretation. So there's not even a possibility of misinterpretation.
Right.
I would say, in the way that it can be experienced.
Because it's supposed to be misinterpreted.
Yeah, or because there's just in order to have a misinterpretation, you have to have some correct interpretation. So
Right.
I think, yeah, that's the interesting thing, is that often people assume that there is a correct interpretation of what this smell is referencing. And so if to someone it smells like a forest floor, and then to someone else it smells like a cucumber or something, that difference is,
Biological?
Well, yeah, biological, psychological, and just based on the history of and their memories, their individual memories that they've accumulated throughout their lifetime. But whatever their interpretation is correct as insofar as anyone can judge.
Right.
So there's nothing to misinterpret because there's nothing like that's the right answer for anyone.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so fugitive.
mm-hmm.
And I wonder
Yeah.
if you could speak about that too.
Yeah, maybe just to jump off this idea, is there a correct interpretation, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot as well. And this is not directly related to the program here, but I curated an exhibition maybe in 2010 called An Act of Mischievous Misreading that kind of really it looked at artists that are working with other people's artwork, but kind of using it to their own end or their own purpose, purposefully looking at them or overlooking things or reading things differently. And there's a word in German called Deutungshoheit, which means like that there's an authority over interpretation. And I think that's something that I've always kind of wanted to kind of push against, and because that means that there's one experience and one way of living in the world, and that is kind of prior to others. And of course, in some ways there might be something that's truer than others, but when it comes to sensorial experiences, I think that is certainly not the way, and especially in art, that doesn't always bring us much further. And at the point where the artist is no longer there to correct us or to leave notes behind, it's really up to us to kind of take them in the direction that we want to take them to. So this idea of kind of a conditioned sense and it being formed by our memories and our own experience is something that I'm really interested in. And Sean, can you speak a bit more about the experiences to have, like how widely they diverge from each other, like when you present someone with a smell or a taste, like do you find that there's a middle ground, or do they?
There is some. I would say that it's almost as much commonality as it is difference. It's really a bit of both. And maybe if you ask 10 people, it's not like you would get 10 totally different responses, but you might get like 3 subsets. That's my sense of just a random sampling. Is there might be like 3 people that think it's a bit like this, and then 3 people that's a bit like this other thing, and then maybe 1 outlier that has a completely different interpretation, and then there's kind of like groups within the larger group, I guess, often.
But I think there's a really creative potential to kind of go with the seemingly different or wrong or maybe perceivedly wrong intuition, and I think that's a lot of artists have made use of synesthesia that way.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask Joey and Andria too, because so many of these one of the reasons I assembled this panel was because there's so many exhibitions that are addressing these different sensoriums or these different ways of being in space. From your curatorial side and even the artist side, what do you think some of the reasons are why there's such a resurgence in this kind of more romantic way of experiencing immersion?
I don't know if it's a resurgence as much as it maybe never ended. I think that so much of the connection between sensorial experience of art connects to memory, connects to the body, connects to a desire to have an emotional relationship with an art object, because your senses.
But that did kind of end in the 2000s. It wasn't as present on an institutional scale, I think.
Maybe. I mean, you could also talk about abstraction as having the same kind of sensorial experience. I've been thinking about the idea, I always say vibey sculptures,
Right.
sculptures with feelings, or that space of energy or erratic feeling you might have, especially an object that you can touch. Maybe it's in an outdoor space, so there's a tactility, but I think that question of, I mean, Taube and Eliane's show was very much about abstraction, about very complex ideas about abstraction as it relates to physics and phenomenology. But because it was also very basically tied to your own physical, audio, sensorial experience, your own body touching a wall, there wasn't the same kind of, I think, fear of abstraction that you often encounter in a museum context, or particular kinds of museum contexts that I think it kind of opened a door. And I'm curious, actually, Sean and Joey, if that's something you've noticed, that the addressing sensorial experience, whether it creates new access points for art audiences that may not be as versed in the institution.
Well, I think also maybe thinking about answering your question, but also thinking about the idea of confusion. For me, it was actually kind of strange when you asked me to be on the panel, because I was like, I don't actually work with sound or smell. Like, it didn't occur to me that I had.
You did.
And it's because I usually don't start from that. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm going to work with the sound artist now. It's usually the idea, and then that artist starts, might choose to use sound or scent. But I think there is this kind of potentiality to dislodge a kind of or habitual conditions that has larger social political implications. That's, for me, these kind of exhibitions have that capacity to.
And that was sort of what I'm hinting at in terms of the increase in these exhibitions recently, is that maybe we need a different way of looking at the body or engaging with the body when there are so many politicized, when it's such a politicized moment to have a body in the first place.
I'm curious how do you see now as different? If you're thinking of it as a change, what describes this moment of immersion versus, say, like a Pippi sculpture or installation from whatever date?
Sure, and I was thinking about that when we just had this thing, and I jotted it down. I think it has to do with exhibition documentation and history, too, which is that it's so difficult to document these oral experiences or scent-based experiences or taste-based experiences in the ways that exhibitions have been documented.
Right.
And that could also be a portion of it. Maybe you might be right, and maybe nothing has changed.
I'm just thinking of artists like, I know Haegu Yang has used scents in her work.
Right, but when you buy a catalog of hers, you don't get that.
True. She should put something, a scratch
She should
and
have
sniff in
scented
there.
or lickable. Every artist should have lickable catalogs.
Yeah.
And scratch and sniff catalogs.
Sean, have you studied a history of scent in art beyond what's been happening recently?
Not formally, I've kind of delved into that. I think there's definitely, I think not everybody, like a lot of people point to Duchamp piece where he made this like perfume. That's like one early example, I guess. Everybody has like a Duchamp did this, kind of, interpretation, I think, of almost any area, But I think mostly, I think it's just very silent for a while, and then I think it was in the 70s. Sissel Tolis was doing work. I don't know if everyone's familiar with her work, but she's one of the early, I would say, early contemporary, scent artists. But yeah, I think it largely was, within industry. It was largely scents were developed, and especially scent molecules, which I talked about a little bit. But those were developed by companies, because the resources needed to do that is often pretty, considerable. And I really do think that, there's some scientists that, one example is Philip Kraft at Givaudan, one of the larger fragrance companies. But, they really do have such an extremely creative and, approach to what they do. And, I don't think that there necessarily needs to be a kind of consideration of whether it is happening within the art world or not. I just happen to be mostly, viewing my own work, and people view my work through that lens. I don't have the technical skills to be that kind of scientist, at Givaudan, but I do find it very interesting. And So yeah, so I think, but anyway, to answer your question, I think most of the fragrance developments have been on the industry side, and then but there are a handful of artists that have been doing it at least since the 70s, I think, as a practice.
And I, yes.
Just a quick follow-up, because it's commonly known that scent has a more direct access to memory, than a lot of other senses. So in that sense, sense also has a it's somehow stronger than our visual memory. So do you find that in the memory of your exhibitions, because I guess it gets connected now, so you remember the space, you remember the time, your own body, and so when you speak to people who experienced your exhibitions a while ago, do you feel like they have a different access than maybe people that try to recall a more visual exhibition?
Yeah, I have heard, some people have told me instances where maybe when they smelled a certain scent in one of my exhibitions, it was pretty new and unfamiliar. But then later, perhaps that week, they were at some market, and then they smelled that in the air or something. So I think that is pretty interesting, and I experienced that myself as well. And also there's certain molecules that I use. It's like kind of certain molecules that I used to work with a long time ago, relatively speaking, in my practice that I haven't really worked with in a while, and then every now and then I'll smell something, or I'll reopen that bottle in the studio, and then it does bring back a lot of memories. And I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of that is one of the main kind of ways of thinking about scent, is how connected to memory it is. And so with a lot of my work, I'm not necessarily using the scent that I'm presenting to people to reference specific memories, but it does become then a way, something that then will be referenced in later memories, when they experience that kind of scent later on in a different time. So yeah.
Great. And I think we have time for one or two questions if there are any in the audience. Yes. Can you do Julie and then Gareth?
Hi. I wanted to ask you, Andria, what was the starting point of your exhibition? Who had this idea of this collaboration? Was it like a mutual admiration, or was it you?
No, it was, I invited Tauba to do an exhibition, a solo exhibition, and she was really interested in collaborating. And we talked about a number of different people, and she was interested in collaborating with an experimental musician, and Eliane had been on her mind for a while, and so she invited Eliane, kind of cold call, and sent her this huge package of things to kind of tell her about herself. And then it was a series of visits, and it did take some time to sort of solidify what that collaboration would mean. Eliane doesn't normally work in the visual environment.
This is kind of like a two-part question, so I'm sorry about that, and the talk was wonderful. But my first question is, do you think the arts, especially curators in general, can learn about working with immersive sensory experiences through culinary arts? I think of artists like Grant Achatz or Ferran Adria, and the way that they're using smell and senses beyond taste to create immersive experiences. And also, do you think there's room, once we get to a point where we're starting to understand alterity within our own bodies, do you think art has the capacity to allow us to experience alterity beyond an anthropocentric standpoint, to have immersive experiences that allow us to experience an empathic response to plants or architecture similar to the vibrations in the exhibition with Tauba?
I have one thought about in relation to plants. It's an extremely interesting area where there's so much being discovered about how plants communicate using chemicals, using molecules that they emit into the air. I mean, one example that's pretty interesting is, for example, if the smell of cut grass. One of the molecules is cis-3-hexanol, and that is it's kind of almost like a pheromone, although you wouldn't call it a pheromone because it's communicating between species rather than within species. But you know, a lot of plants that are distressed by whatever outside organism, often it's a bug eating at the plant, they'll release this scent compound, and it's also an attractant for certain types of wasps that then come and feed on the caterpillar. And so it's a kind of plant, defense mechanism. And I think as science is getting further and further into scent and looking at this, like there's a whole range of kind of interspecies communication that happens and kind of regulates certain ecosystems. And, it's a very interesting area. And I think, in a way that it can kind of hint at, something outside of just a human-centric approach, potentially. Yeah.
I imagine that as virtual reality, augmented reality becomes more and more viable and more advanced, that kind of immersion will be a tool that artists use in a more complex way than just employing what headset. I can imagine somebody wanting to take a headset and put it in a sensorial environment and create something close to reality. It's interesting, we're talking about immersion when the immersion that so many artists are working with is digital.
Right.
But this is so much more about the physical space.
Yeah.